Well, hello, and welcome to our continuing devotional. I'm currently going through the book of Colossians, and we're going to be picking it up today in Colossians chapter 1. Um, and we'll be picking up in verse 9, even though we covered that in part in our last devotional. But I want you to see the full picture in the background. Paul has already talked about, in verses 3 through 8, the positive impact of the gospel. They have faith, they have hope, they have love, they have a true understanding of the gospel. But in verses 9 through 14, Paul prays for four things for people who are already Christians. We could call these four goals of the Christian life. And I want to spend the next devotional or two talking about those. Let's go ahead and read verses 9 through 14, and then we'll begin to break it down. Verse 9 says this, "And so from the day we heard, we've not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding, so as to walk in a manner worthy of the Lord, fully pleasing to him, bearing fruit in every good work and increasing in the knowledge of God, being strengthened with all power according to his glorious might, for all endurance and patience with joy, giving thanks to the Father who has qualified you to share in the inheritance of the saints in light. He has delivered us from the domain of darkness and transferred us to the kingdom of his beloved Son, in whom we have redemption, the forgiveness of sins." Now that's a lot. We're certainly not going to cover all of that in this devotional, but I wanted to read the whole thing because I want you to see the big picture of the four goals of every Christian, the four goals that you and I should have. To be enlightened. He says in verse 9, we need to be filled with the knowledge of his will. That should be a goal, to know God's will better. To be godly. He talks about in verse 10, walking worthy and pleasing to God. It's not, God is not indifferent to how we live. He wants us to be enlightened. He wants us to have knowledge, but he also wants to live that knowledge out, to be godly. To be strong, he says in verse 11, to be strengthened with all of his power, to not give in to every trial or temptation or struggle in life, and to be thankful. Verse 12 talks about giving thanks to the Father. Now we're going to look at those in more detail over the next couple of devotional, but let's start with verse 9, where Paul says, "From the day that we heard, we have not ceased to pray for you, asking that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will and all spiritual wisdom and understanding." So from the day, he says, we heard you became Christians, we've not ceased to pray for you. See, becoming a Christian is not the end goal. It's not the ultimate goal. In the same way, we rejoice when a wife conceives. The husband rejoices that she's conceived. But after the conception, there's the birth, and after the birth, there's the raising of the child, the educating of the child, the leading the child to maturity. And the same thing is true in the Christian life. We have this miracle new birth. They're a miracle of God, and they're brought into the world with great joy. A person becomes a Christian, but they've not arrived at that point. We're not content for them to remain a helpless babe. We want them to grow in knowledge, grow in strength, and grow in character, and grow in maturity. And that's what Paul says here. We want you to grow in those areas. And then he says, here are the four goals of the Christian life. And the first one is that they would be enlightened. Now, when you hear the word enlightenment, don't think of some mystical, ethereal sense, like you might hear a yogi from India talk about reaching enlightenment or reaching nirvana or anything of that nature. But he means enlightened in the sense of simply knowing and having a better understanding of God and his word. He says in verse 9 there, "I ask that you may be filled with the knowledge of his will." That means overflowing with an understanding of his will. In the same way that somebody can have a great knowledge of sport or music or finances or cars, that's a lifelong ongoing process. You don't just have a data dump and you got it all. It's ongoing. It's never ending. That's the same way with knowledge of God. We know him and come to know his will through a lifelong process of spending time in prayer, in fellowship with others, and particularly spending time in his word and knowing his will. It's a spiritual knowledge that we are after. He goes on from there to talk about the second goal, which is to be godly, and we'll talk about that goal in our next devotional. Have a blessed day.